Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 23. I'm Eric, the IT guy Hendricks, your host, and joining me, as always, is my trusty co-host, Scott McBrien. How are we doing today?
Uh, every day is a great day.
Well, we could debate that, but I'm not sure. But anyway, we're today we're going to talk about a technology I'm pretty excited about, not only from a recovering systems administrator perspective, but also from a demonstration perspective, and we'll get into why that is here in a little bit. We are, of course, talking about session recording within Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And so to kick us off, what we need to do is we actually need to install our package. So there is a package called tlog that we need. And because we want to also show how this looks in the web console, we're going to go ahead and grab the cockpit session recording RPM as well. So we'll do a DNF install to grab tlog and the session recording plugin for web console. Once that install is complete, we need to go ahead and make sure that our cockpit, our web console, is actually running. So we'll do that with the systemctl cockpit.socket, and then it is dead. So we need to do an enable tac now, which is something that I didn't know about until just a couple of years ago. You can actually there it goes. Oh yeah, helps if we spell socket right. So it is active. It is listening. So the web console is a little bit different. It's not a service. It is a socket. So it listens kind of passively for anyone to access that port before it really goes active. So a little bit different there. So keep that in mind as you're going to as you're going through these steps on your own. So let's go ahead and log into our web console here. We've spent some time in the console before, but today we're going to point out that there is a session recording tab now on the left-hand side. So if we go into session recording, we'll start out with a list of recordings. Of course, we just installed and enabled this, so we don't have any. So we need to go ahead and go in and set that up. So if we go to, if we click on the little gear icon there, top middle of your screen, and we can configure different settings, which we'll get into in the second half of the show. But what we want to do first is let's go ahead and enable session recording for all. So under SSSD config, we want to change scope to all, save that change. And once that change has been saved, we can go into a live terminal here for this system. And then if we do an SU to, say, root or do an SSH, either works. We ran into this the other day. Did we have to use 127?
No, it's complaining about the user is being refused from SSH. We do this.
And if you just SU back to yourself, I think that works as well. So then there's that line in our login prompt that says, "Attention, your session is being recorded." So now any actions that we take within a terminal session will now be recorded in real time. And so if we go ahead and start generating a recording here, if we do a who, if we maybe cat out some files, look at some directories, if we look at some installed packages, for instance. And what's really cool is the session recording actually also affects VI files. We can actually see that in the session recording. So if we jump back into our web console, and then if we refresh our page, we can actually see that there should now be a session recording available. So we notice that the user is root, and then is our RHEL user that we've been using. And just like if we're watching a video, there's your typical fast forward, rewind. You can resize the output, and then if you hit play, it actually shows us the actual live session in real time. So Scott, I know I did a lot of talking there, but did I kind of skip over anything?
No, I think that's good. We're just watching the session playback, um, and kind of why we're interested in enabling session recording. I think there's a couple different reasons. One is the auditing that it provides to us, right? So we can actually like watch this session as it occurred in history. So a lot of security standards will ask for this to be the case on your system. So, for example, the DISASTIG will ask for you to record sessions of users so that you can have it for auditing purposes later. Um, it traditionally on earlier versions of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, we had to do that through a program called AuditD, and the setup was really messy, and the output that was captured and actually replaying the session was hard. And session recording makes it super easy. So that's like one use case that if you have these security standards that you comply with and they require auditing or the recording of what activities users are doing, this is an easy way to meet that requirement. The other thing I really like about this is when we're capturing the data, not only are we capturing the commands that were entered, but we're also capturing all the output and all of the error messages that occurred during this session. So inevitably, someone will call you and will say something like, I was doing such and such on the machine and I had an error. And of course, you hear that and you're like, cool, what was the error? They're like, I don't know. Just said something was permission denied. Right. And you're lucky if you get that much detail that it was something permission
Right.
denied. Right. Um, so this would allow you to go back and look at their session and actually see what was actually happening. Right. And maybe the reason that they're getting a permission denied is because they used a file that didn't exist, or they're logged in as the wrong person. There's a whole bunch of things that could cause that error, and you could actually see exactly what was happening in their session when they encountered that. So it's a really useful diagnostic tool when working with other people in your system. The other place where I think it's really handy is during the inevitable postmortem that you'll get. So if you're doing like a maintenance, for example, and other administrators are working on the machines and something goes wrong, you're able to kind of replay exactly what happened during that maintenance cycle to figure out what was occurring in that maintenance activity that went pear shaped.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can figure out how you should do it better in the future. And it becomes kind of a training tool as well, um, to help make your team better over time.
That's the part that I get really excited about is the training aspect, because obviously the auditing, the security implications are fairly obvious here, of being able to say that Joe logged into this server at 2 a.m. and he was doing something um, less than friendly, uh, and you can then prove that out with without any without any uncertainty in your mind. But one of the other extensions to this is, like you said, was training. I don't see the option offhand, but as I recall, you can actually export these screen recordings to regular video files like an MP4. And so a lot of the videos that I produce, I'll actually use session recording to capture my live demo, and then export that as a video file, and then layer in the audio and the any like narration that I'm doing over the top of it using T-Log session recording. So it makes for a really helpful uh, training tool. So if you've got a team wiki, or if you have if you have some kind of a training site that you use to, this is how you do things in our environment, you can actually go in and use those video files. Um, So we actually had a great question in the chat. Scott, you want to verbalize that for me?
Sure. So let me go back to my session recording panel here in. Uh-oh. Try this one more time.
While you're pulling that up,
Yeah,
we just got some pretty heavy thunder here. So if I drop off, carry on without me.
will do. All right. So here in the settings gear, we just went through and kind of accepted all of the defaults. And so you could see things like this was the message that we got when we logged in as our user that told us that session recording is active. And that's something that you can change. Um, there's things about like how we capture the session to store it. But the question in chat was, where do the session recordings get saved? And so right here, um, in the writer field, this is where the session recordings get saved. So the default configuration is that it goes into the journal log. So you interact with journal CTL to get those log entries out. But notice that you could also change it to syslog, and you could send all of this recording data to your syslog subsystem, and then the syslog.conf rules would decide what actual files, or even if it needs to be offloaded onto another host, the data should be. And then you can also tell it a specific file if you want, right? So you can change the parameters here, and then it will adjust accordingly. Um, Up here a little bit higher, if you said that you wanted a file, you tell it what path that should be stored in. If you say that you want it to be syslog, here's the service that it comes from and the log priority that it comes from. That's how you control your syslog rules to decide where it needs to be stored in your syslog setup. So what this looks like on the other side is over here. We can do a journal CTL. And what we want to do is we want to look for a specific string. All of our session recordings will have a unique recording ID in them. So if we look for yeah, I'm having trouble typing today. So what we see out of this is the content of our recorded session. And right here is the unique identifier. Every recording has a unique UID that goes with it. And then here's the text that's actually a component of it. And so when we do the play, it's actually going back through the journal log, grabbing out all of the data that has this unique UID that's tied to this specific session, and then just replaying the text that was received as part of that log action.
You mean
So,
you don't want to watch the Matrix scroll by?
right. So things like that in web console player, that's what it's doing. We also have a command line player too called tlog, tlog play, sorry,
Yep.
that we got when we installed the tlog RPM. And so we can just use this UID. Right, so I'm logged in as the RHEL user, and then there was a pause as we transitioned to the second part of the show. Then I cleared off the screen, so that should come in shortly. And then I started doing stuff, right, so that we could record the session. So we're seeing this being played back in my local terminal because it's just replaying that data that was assigned to that unique recording ID that we did, right? So the next thing we'll see is me editing that file. My file, not Eric's file, my file.
You know, I wish I would have had session recording back when I was a sysadmin that worked in an office, because we always had that manager that liked to hover. This would have been a great way to just be kind of tapping on your desk and have stuff scrolling by on the screen and make it look like I was working when, reality I was asleep. Okay, don't actually do that.
That. Um, so when we know uh, where it's being stored and what message content is there, I mentioned putting it off on another host. So you could do things like um, change your logging method from journal to syslog, and then in your syslog configuration, tell it that that should be sent to a syslog service, another host. So you're not just reliant on the local logs on the system, you can actually retrieve them elsewhere. If your syslog forwards that to Elasticsearch or other places, you can store it other places as well.
Oh, yeah, Elasticsearch would be a great one. I didn't think about that. So Steve in the chat mentioned asks if the recordings are saved in a format where they can be sent to people like auditors and whatnot. Um, Go ahead.
So, Eric, I think that's back to your statement about exporting them as video files,
Mhm.
so that you can do that. And let's see if that's here in the web console because I can't remember.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't see it.
It, that may be a feature in the upstream project and just hasn't made its way down to RHEL. Hmm. So the I'm trying to think here. That's kind of thrown me off. Um, we'll double check, Steve, but I'm pretty sure that there is a way to export as something like an MP4. Um, So while Scott had to step away for just a second here, the fun of doing a live event, feel free to throw any questions that you have within the chat, and we'll, as you can see, we'll address them live on air. I also threw this link up just a minute ago about if you go out to lab.redhat.com, there's a couple of dozen. There's a couple of dozen different labs about different Red Hat Enterprise Linux operations from Admin 101 stuff. Some of the episodes of Into the Terminal that we've done actually were inspired by were actually inspired by some of the labs that we've already got built. And vice versa. Some episodes of Into the Terminal are actually going to inspire some content this summer for lab.redhat. But if you head out to that link, you can actually walk through this very same lab yourself and try out session recording for yourself. It really is a helpful tool, not just from an auditing and security perspective, but also from a learning and training operation. In fact, when I work in my home lab, I kind of wish I would have set this up some time ago. One of the other things that we can do that we'll talk about here in just a minute is the ability to define user groups or a subset of people that that have access or that get recorded. You may not want if you have a terminal session that just sits idle and tails out some logs. You may not want session recording to take place on those or certain users. When we started today's presentation, we just went to SSSD and selected all. But if and actually looks like Scott's back. So if we was just talking about how we can actually include a subset of users. So why don't we dive back into the settings gear and talk a little bit more about uh, some of the we kind of already ran through this. One thing we didn't touch on though was the ability to change the scope. So we can actually specify only a list of users or only a certain set of groups. So you may only want, say, the wheel group. So only those people with administrators have excuse me, only administrators have their sessions recorded. So there's a lot of different combinations that you can do with that. Although in most situations, if you're going to do session recording for activity on a server, uh, probably easiest just to start with all and go from there.
So I saw an interesting question from Shantanu in the chat as well, um, about the scope of what sessions are recorded. So sessions are recorded when you create a login shell. So that means that SSH would be included in that. If you SSH to a box, it automatically starts recording your session. Local sessions, like you log in through the terminal, it will also start recording your session. The place where we don't record is if you log in through the graphical desktop, right? So the graphical desktop doesn't spawn a traditional login shell, instead spawns a shell to then run your desktop session. In fact, it's managed by the session manager of the desktop environment. And so we don't record graphical desktop sessions with session recording. Only log in through the terminal or log in through modes like SSH.
But
And I did want to show one other cool thing, Eric,
yeah,
in this individual session. So one of the other things that you can do in individual sessions, because the actual logs are stored as text, is you can search for search terms in your recorded sessions, and it will give you a list of time codes where that search term exists. So um, you can click on the time code and it'll jump you to that spot in the recorded session. And you can see that if there's multiple instances, it will give you multiple time codes as well. So that's something that, like, especially if you're looking at someone's recorded session that might be long, you can get to specific things. So again, in the situation where somebody says I have an error, you could search for the word error, and it would show you where that occurred in their session.
okay, that's cool. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. I think we've pretty well answered all the session recording based questions. Any other cool little nuggets you want to share, Scott?
Um, Oh, there is one other thing in the settings that I think is interesting. So remember a while ago I mentioned that in previous versions of RHEL, so basically RHEL 7 and earlier, we had to use auditd to configure something like this. One of the irritations with using auditd was it also captures the user's input. So if they're on the command line and they SSH to another box, or they're running a command that requires them to put in credentials, um, auditd would capture that, and that would actually be stored in your audit logs, that password credential that they were asked to enter. You can see here in session recording, you can also capture that if you want with this user's input checkbox, but by default that's disabled. So if somebody types stuff into the keyboard, we don't capture what's going into the keyboard. We only capture what's on the screen. So if you wanted to capture that user input, you could do it as here as well, but that's generally, you know, recommended against, which is why it's not turned on by default. So Steve Cassidy asks about what happens if somebody deletes the logs. So that's where hooking into rsyslog would be handy,
Mm-hmm.
because not only would you have a local copy of the logs that you could use to, you know, do your playback and use the session recording um, features here in the local machine's web console, you would also have a copy of those stored on a remote system
Mm-hmm.
through rsyslog shipping the logs elsewhere. Um, so you could then go to that remote system and use something like tlog play with the log ID to to view it on that remote system as well. So yeah, depending on how you do your configuration, you can choose to store them other places besides locally, but it will require additional services. And that
Mhm.
reminds me, Eric, I don't think we have syslog in any of our into the terminal topics. That might be a good one to add on when we run out of things.
Yeah, we haven't covered our syslog yet, but we should definitely have an episode about logging and a topic I'd be interested in is how to make sense of said logs. There's nothing like digging through and looking for words like error or fail, and then having to search for whatever text string comes after that. Um, but yeah, session recording definitely helps a lot with that. In fact, when I was a sysadmin, one of the companies I worked for, we actually kept all logs on the local host system for I think about 7 days, and then they were also copied over to log servers, which were just little one-use boxes, but they had multiple just, uh, very large spinning disk, cheap storage, and they were kept there for 90 days or something along those lines. Um, yes, anyone who gets our syslog is definitely a unicorn. I have to look that up just about every time. But apparently Scott knows much about our syslog, so we'll have him join us with a sparkly unicorn horn. Before we paint a more vivid picture than that, why don't we wrap up today's episode? Next week we've got a little bit different episode than normal, but there's this little get together in a couple of weeks called Summits. I think it's just a couple of people getting coffee, or it may just be an online event of the year. Virtual event that you won't want to miss. So we're going to take an episode and talk about what is Summit, what are some of the topics that are coming up, how can you get engaged, and maybe even some other places where you might get content or hang out with Scott or I, whether that's Reddit or other places that you can get engaged on a more person to person level with both RHEL and other RHEL users. Scott, any closing thoughts before we wrap today?
Just don't forget to hit that like button. And if you think somebody else would benefit from this, share. Eric, I saw that you posted earlier the link to the lab so people could try it for themselves, and already available RHEL VM in our lab systems that's publicly available. So that's about it. Oh, and for those of you who like dark mode, we'll be doing this again on dark mode tonight.
Let's see. Summit link off the top of my head, I think it's just red.ht/summit. Should get you at least close. So if you want to head out there, you can get registered for free. There's a really cool schedule builder, so you can pick out the events that you want to see and kind of hit all the sessions. I think that's the short link that should get you out to the full website. But with that being said, we're at time. So like Scott said, make sure to like and share this content, because the more engagement we get from all of you, the more time we can spend focusing on making more content, better content, and having less broken demos in the middle of our shows. All right, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. Join Scott tonight for Dark Mode, and we'll see you next week.